We have not been here for a while. Scott has been putting over work on his 2 podcasts. You can check them out in the links below. But we're back. We're going to talk about polarizing quarterbacks. We really haven't done this since the beginning of the year, so a lot of values have changed. Scott knows a lot more than I do. So if you like this video, make sure you go check out his podcast. But Scott, do you want to maybe give a small introduction just because we haven't done this in so long, or you want to jump right into it?
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be back. This is the first time we've recorded together. So we're just going to go through and do kind of like a reality check on each position. And we'll start with quarterbacks. And what generated this idea was basically, there's been a lot of value changes in terms of players since the beginning of last season. And on a lot of players, I think the values have adjusted. They've gotten some hype. They've built some steam in terms of people wanting to acquire them. So there's probably, I'd say, 25% or so players have kind of adjusted to the correct value. But other than that, I found myself even surprised when, I'll see the value on a current player, or someone will say, this is what I'm willing to pay for this player, or this is what I think they're worth. And just in your mind, as closely as a lot of us have followed this for the last year, you kind of get a perception of like, okay, yeah, when you say a player's name and you give me the format, I can tell you in a ballpark what he's worth, or what he should be traded for, or what you should ask for if someone wants them to acquire for their team. But some of that kind of goes out the window after the season. You start to digest, not only what happened in the season, but what could happen going forward. So I just wanted to touch on some players that are clear players that have risen up that I don't think their values have been caught up to in terms of people's perception. And then other players' values that are completely in the tank that I still think that are on people's rosters, and they tend to think they're worth more than they are. And I have a trade when we get later on. I have a trade I wanted to tell you that really first trade in a while that's just blown me away, but I saw it go down about an hour ago in one of my leagues. So I'll bring that up when we get to the wide receivers. But you want to start with quarterbacks, and we'll just kind of go through on that?
Yeah, sounds good. Do you want to start us off with a quarterback that is just skyrocketing value right now?
Yeah, so the first one I'll bring up that I think is a player that I had been trying to sell throughout the season, and kind of unfair to say that this player had much of an opportunity to gain any value because I thought he was massively overvalued to end last season. But that was Jared Goff. He was quarterback 4 to end last season, so December 2018 was quarterback 4, probably because he went to the Super Bowl and had a pretty good season in 2018, but you just look at this year and you look at where he's being valued, and I think he's down kind of in that tier where the only thing that is keeping Jared Goff's value ahead of, a lot of the guys that could potentially lose their jobs within a year or less is the fact that he's under contract long-term with the Rams. And essentially he's tied there to a situation where they're not in the greatest cap situation either. So you can't write a narrative unless he's just so woefully bad that he loses his job in the next 2 years. You just can't see a scenario where he's not the starting quarterback for the Rams for at least, the next 3 or 4 years, if not more, beyond his contract that he just signed. But you just look at that, and that's the only thing that's keeping his value up. It's his actual performance on the field is not at all keeping his performance up. And I think you won't find many people out there that want to buy Jared Goff at this point, especially when, I don't know how much you followed the Rams throughout this year, but they really started to transform their offense, especially after Brandon Cooks got hurt and missed a lot of the time during the middle of the season. And then, Cooper Kupp crushed it for the first half of the year. He kind of surprised everybody coming off the ACL injury, and, he absolutely smashed for like the first half of the year to the point where, he was fetching top 5 wide receiver prices in Dynasty. And at that point, you're kind of like, wow, I don't know if he can keep this up. It's really volume dependent. And you just kind of looked at and you said the Rams have had 3 receivers in their offense, and can they actually sustain one of these guys smashing as much as Cooper Kupp did? And obviously he didn't. He faded towards the end of the season. Robert Woods emerged as essentially the go-to guy. He had a couple games, massive ceiling games in the last half of the season. And they also started using the tight end more. Gerald Everett had a couple huge games during the middle of the year. Then when Gerald Everett got injured, Tyler Higbee came on and had 3 or 4 just absolute smash games during the fantasy playoffs. So, Jared Goff really, the only thing keeping him up is the fact that he's tied into the Rams offense. But, what is the Rams offense going forward? Like, is it going to be this high-powered fantasy offense that, could potentially see Jared Goff being a top 12 quarterback every single year going forward. And I don't necessarily think that, especially with the emergence of, if you look at the top 6 or 7 dynasty quarterbacks right now, Lamar Jackson, other than Patrick Mahomes, it's Dak Prescott, it's Kyler Murray, it's all guys that can run. It's all guys that can get points with their legs. And that's something that Jared Goff's never going to be able to do. So I look at Jared Goff as being one of those guys that not only, didn't have a great fantasy season. If you just look at this season, he finished, aside removing some of the guys that only started a few games, he wasn't even a quarterback 2. He finished right on the fringe in terms of point per game. He was 25th in terms of points per game this year at the quarterback position. So, unless the Rams offense really reboots itself and gets back to where they were a couple years ago, in your eyes, what is the difference between him and other guys that essentially just are going to keep their jobs going forward? To me, he's really no different than some of those back end quarterback 2s that you're just hoping for a certain year where everything hits on all cylinders and he bounces back. I don't think he's outside of the top 24 going forward, but I don't think you can draft him thinking he's going to be a top 12 guy. He's kind of like a poor man's Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan's had a ton of seasons where, he's maybe a fringe top 15 quarterback, but then clearly he's had 2 years where he just absolutely crushed it. So I think that's where Goff is, and just nobody really wants to pay for a guy like that right now in Dynasty.
Another thing with Goff is the Rams have absolutely no picks for the next 2 years. So they have not only are they not going to be able to replace him, they're not going to put anybody around him. And Brandon Cook's contract looks horrible. He's probably going to get cut. Who knows what Gurley is going to be with his knee. But, I think he should be valued where Dalton was valued about a year or 2 ago, just because the ceiling isn't even there. In his perception was a year ago, but now it's clear that I think the Rams are going to be one of the worst NFL franchises in a couple of years with how horrible. I saw some stat that they have 6 players accounting for over 70% of their cap space in a couple of years, and they have no picks to really do anything about it.
Yeah, they traded their first rounder for Jalen Ramsey, and they have to sign him. So that's going to add to essentially, they can't just let him walk, giving up what they did. That's a player that they have to sign. So I think that it's just more of a, there could be a point where Goff becomes a value, kind of like Matthew Stafford did last year. Matthew Stafford was down outside the top 20. And, there is some security in knowing that, hey, this guy's going to be a starter for 4 years. He's not going to get benched. He is tied to a guy that we think is a pretty decent offensive mind. So you have to think that after the last 2 seasons that McVay is going to get back into, the boardroom and kind of draw up maybe an offense that's a little bit different than what we've seen. So it may not be the same thing that we saw in 2017 or 2018. But I'm not saying that it's just going to completely go downhill. But there's just not really a ceiling for Goff. So maybe in another season, if he kind of lingers at this value, you may be willing to pay for his security. Because you mentioned Dalton, that the only thing separating Goff from those type of guys that are just year to year is essentially his job security. And that's really it. So he's one of the ones I wanted to touch on that had a massive drop off. Another one I wanted to mention.
Real quick, Scott, I think it's important to reference too, because I know we play in only Superflex and 2 QB leagues. So his value is a lot higher there just because of security. But in a 1 QB league, I don't think he has much value whatsoever. Just because job security doesn't necessarily matter that much there. Rather, we're just looking at absolute ceilings.
Oh yeah, no, he's absolutely just essentially he is just a streamer in a 1 quarterback league. And it's a shallow enough league. He may be even a guy that you put on waiver wire where, you may hold him just as a streamer that you play in the matchups, but that's really it. He has really no value in a 1 quarterback league outside of that. Another one I did want to mention, this is just one that kind of jumped out at me that I think is still being, I don't want to say that he's still being overvalued, but just I'm curious as to where this is going to go in the next couple months. But Jameis Winston, this is one that's very polarizing for people because there's literally a crowd that says Jameis Winston had one of the best fantasy seasons of all time, which he did for the quarterback position. But then another one that says Jameis Winston literally might not have a starting job in the NFL in the next 4 months. I've always been on the train that Jameis Winston is an NFL starter. Now, I don't think you're ever going to get a situation where somebody comes to him and says, we're handing you the keys for the next 5 years. We're giving you a long-term deal and committing to building the team around you. But he's one of those guys that right now he's quarterback 13, but I think that's going to fall big time over the next couple months. People are going to start elevating some of these guys that have job security. Say somebody like Drew Lock or Dwayne Haskins. I think they're going to start to be elevated over, someone like Jameis Winston. If you went and tried to trade Jameis Winston right now for Dwayne Haskins or Drew Lock, decent chance that the other owner is going to decline and say, why would I take the risk of a guy that's been through 5 years now, who his team just had a great offensive season and they may not bring him back. So I can understand where, someone's not going to really want Jameis Winston right now. So I think his value is going to drop a ton, probably outside the top 20 in the next couple months in terms of ADP. But I want to get your thoughts on Winston, because if he comes back to Tampa Bay, I want to just bring to the attention Carson Palmer's first year under Bruce Arians when he took over in Arizona. Carson Palmer had 24 touchdowns and 22 interceptions, and he turned the ball over just as many times as Jameis Winston, or just as many times as he did scored touchdowns for that first year under Arians. And if you guys remember, Carson Palmer always had the reputation of being one of those, high risk, high reward quarterbacks. He made a lot of mistakes early in his career when he's with the Bengals, and he was always one of those guys that you said he's really talented, has a great arm, but was prone to making mistakes. And he showed that his first year under Arians. And then the next 3 years after that, when they stuck with him, his second year under Arians, he was 35 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. So, if Winston can just come back and give one more season, get a shot for one more season, he could potentially be a guy that goes from, 32 touchdowns to 35. And if he can cut those interceptions down to, 16 or 18, to me, that's somebody that has some job security long term. So I think he's a buy where he's going to be valued in the next couple months. But it's tough, because the people that have him, they probably used him all season as their starting quarterback in a super flex league. So they're kind of hesitant to probably give a sell price for him. But I guarantee they're sitting there a little bit worried about what his value is going to do. So want to get what do you think on Winston? Where have you always been? Because my stance has always been pretty clear.
No, I love Winston. I have him in a lot of teams. Like you said, I'm one of those owners who's starting him every week. Especially I have him in one league that's a 6-point passing touchdown league, 20 yards for 1 point passing. And in a league like that, he just absolutely smashes, and he's a league winner. So I'm still buying, because we look around the league and everyone says that every team has quarterback questions. So where are all these quarterbacks coming from? You know what I mean? If the Chargers are looking to move on from Rivers, if the Bears don't want Trubisky, if the Panthers are looking for a quarterback, there are just a list of the Patriots. There are a list of quarterbacks teams that need quarterbacks. So why is Winston not going to have a job? I think he's back in Tampa Bay on a prove it deal where he's going to get paid a lot of money in 2020 with nothing guaranteed afterwards. And I think he's going to ball out. I love Winston, especially if you're on a contending team.
Yeah, and I think that kind of tells the story about the shift of the quarterbacks from last year at this time. We were talking about, wow, the quarterback position has never been deeper. You are able to get guys that had starting jobs that, and like someone like Andy Dalton had a decent season. Marcus Mariota was a complete bust. Derek Carr had a decent season. But these guys you were getting, in the high 20s in terms of where they were coming off the board at quarterback. And, there was kind of a massive tier of the second tier quarterbacks last year, but it's really flip-flopped this year to where you have these clear-cut top six. It's Mahomes, it's Lamar Jackson, it's Deshaun Watson, it's Kyler Murray, it's Dak Prescott, and it's Russell Wilson. And after that, there's a massive drop-off, because you saw guys like Baker Mayfield, Aaron Rodgers, Jared Goff. You saw these guys have disappointing seasons, and they fell off. And so now their value is not nearly as high as it was a year ago. So they're mixed in with guys like Carson Wentz and Josh Allen and Sam Darnold. They're mixed in basically from 7 to, 18. It's all just preference based. And so I'm looking at it. If I have one of those guys, certainly I'm willing to sell someone like Baker Mayfield if I can get, Sam Darnold plus a first round pick or something like that. I'm willing to make the pivots within that tier. So that's kind of what we've seen change in the quarterbacks now. So, when you're looking at someone like Winston, if he's at the bottom of that tier and you're confident with him, the only thing separating those other guys is they have job security. So if you're willing to take the gambles, I think there's some profit that can be made. And again, this is a year-to-year thing. So a year from now, we could be saying, wow, Jameis Winston just had a Carson Palmer X season. They're looking at giving him a 3-year extension. And all of a sudden, he's back up in the top 10 because you know that offense with the weapons that they have is going to produce regardless of who the quarterback is. So if you can guess that right, whether it's Winston or whether it's Dalton or whether it's whoever comes into that situation, they're going to see a value spike in the next 3 or 4 months once we see who Tampa's quarterback's going to be.